Great. Now that we're all seated up here, I'm Fiona Cunningham. I'm a fellow in the cybersecurity project at the Belfer Center. My research looks at particularly Chinese nuclear strategy. So insofar as there are questions and interest in that country's nuclear strategy, I can talk about that. I know we've probably got tons of questions, but I want to start off with just 2 questions based on the 3 presentations that we've just had. We have 9 states that have nuclear weapons. And in the presentations that Will and that Vipin have made, we've already noted that perhaps North Korea doesn't accept some of the ideas of mutually assured destruction that Jim laid out at the beginning, that both countries lose from threatening to use or using nuclear weapons. Vipin highlighted that Pakistan and increasingly India and perhaps the United States also reject some of these tenets. So I'm just curious to get the panel's thoughts on who actually does accept these ideas that everyone loses from using nuclear weapons, and who does?
Let's see. Well, we've got the U.S., Russia, Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Well, Israel does not face really a nuclear adversary yet, and so they can afford to think that way for now. I grabbed Israel before the others did. Anyone else?
I mean, so theoretically, I think one of the, it may be worth just going through like the core assumptions of mutually assured destruction, or the theory of the nuclear revolution that Jim talked about, are that both sides have to accept vulnerability to each other's secure second strike forces. So you get into phases where North Korea probably doesn't have a secure second strike force, right? And it worries about survivability, and that leads to these use it or lose it pressures. So if you don't have survivability, then mad theory of the nuclear revolution doesn't apply. It also doesn't apply when one state does not want to accept vulnerability to the other side's nuclear arsenal. And I think the United States doesn't want to be vulnerable. And the vulnerability is tied up to, there's this notion, the stability-instability paradox. That when you have this condition of nuclear stability that Jim referred to, it opens up space for instability. And the US and the Soviet Union had proxy wars, but the United States, neither side had to deal with terrorism in their homeland, sponsored by the other state. And that's kind of where India is. And I think if Israel ever faced a situation where it had a nuclear adversary, and that adversary was using its nuclear shield to deter retaliation and amplified its support of terrorism, I don't think for a second that Israel wouldn't go to a counterforce strategy. Because at some point domestically, you cannot tolerate certain types of instability or aggression against you. And it becomes existential in the sense that you start asking, how much instability am I willing to tolerate? And that's kind of where India is, and I think other states could get there too. So the requirements for mutually assured destruction are a lot more stringent than I think we used to think in academia. You have to, if you're not willing to accept the vulnerability of the other side's second strike force, then and you're trying to threaten it, then the notion of mutually assured destruction falls apart. And survivability, there's this notion that survivability is easier to achieve, to obtain and maintain than it is to threaten. But the cost is falling on some of these capabilities. Accuracy is becoming cheaper. ISR is becoming cheaper. Look at what we can do with OSINT now, right? If analysts can watch and see what states are doing with their nuclear programs, states can do this stuff now in ways that they haven't been able to do. And that really starts tempting and seducing states to say, I'm just going to get rid of this shield behind which they're aggressive.
So I'll just talk about China, Russia, and the United States, because I think many of the other states have been covered. So China has a doctrine of no first use. They have a relatively small nuclear force structure, and their goal is to hold at risk probably US cities in the event of conflict to deter the conflict. Russia is a very different doctrine, and it'll be interesting to see whether North Korea pursues the Chinese path or the Russian path. Russia's doctrine has, over the last 10 years, made increasing use of nuclear weapons. They now talk about escalating to de-escalate a conflict. In other words, at the very least, a demonstration of use of nuclear weapons, but possibly to, for example, attack conventional forces where they might have a conventional force imbalance. And you saw from President Putin considerable nuclear saber rattling. So they have a very different doctrine. The United States, of course, I think in general accepts most of what Jim talks about. He mentioned that we had a counterforce strategy. I think part of the motivation during the Cold War of the counterforce strategy was deterrence works best when you hold at risk what the enemy values most. And the perception was that the Soviet Union valued most its military forces, particularly its nuclear forces. So holding those forces at risk was actually the best way to deter. I realize that's at variance, that may be a difference. When it comes to North Korea, I think this country has a fundamental decision to make. Are we comfortable with a deterrent relationship with North Korea? If you're not comfortable with that, if you don't believe that that's possible, your options get very, very narrow. I, for one, don't believe a negotiated solution ending the North Korean nuclear program is possible. Simply don't believe that they're willing to give up their weapons through negotiation. If that's the case, force becomes the only option, which would be devastatingly costly. So I think this is a point of public policy that is of fundamental importance. Is deterrence of North Korea possible?
Right. On that happy note, I'll turn to my second question, is that through the course of the 3 presentations, I think we can group the sort of factors that lead to nuclear escalation into 2 groups. One is things that come from arsenals and the weapons themselves, and the other are things that come from other factors. And so we covered things like in Vipin's presentation, the threat of conventional war in South Asia as a driver, public opinion and credibility of things that Jim mentioned. One of the factors that we didn't talk about so much, though, is allies. And so I was wondering if all of you could comment, insofar as you'd like to, on the role of allies in creating pressures for escalation.
And de-escalation.
And de-escalation.
Right, because, I mean, that's what we're seeing in the Korean Peninsula right now. The president threatens to fire and fury on the peninsula, and the South Korean president is forced to go on TV and say, whoa, there won't be any war unless we get a say-so. So sometimes the allies are constraints, because where are you fighting the war? You're not fighting it on U.S. territory, you're fighting it on your allies' territory. And you can imagine that that's a less appealing notion to some of our allies. But yes, you know, and I'll defer to my colleagues, but it can work the other way too. I would think one dynamic is around, and I am a real skeptic about this, there are lots of debates in our community about extended deterrence. Some people feel it's really, really hard to convince our allies that we'd be willing to trade Los Angeles for Seoul, or that sort of thing. I don't think it's that hard. I think we make it harder than it really is. But if you had real concerns about extended deterrence, then you might take all sorts of actions to beef it up. And in a security dilemma where, as you improve your defense, that becomes a threat to your adversary, you can imagine that might be escalatory.
Go ahead.
I mean, the extended deterrence is interesting because the Allies have an infinite appetite for reassurance. Nothing is ever good for them. So you just kind of have to, at some point, the good enough just is. But there's a reason why extended deterrence, it's not for altruistic reasons, right? There are very real strategic reasons why we offer extended deterrence. And one of the biggest reasons, in my view, is so that our allies that might otherwise acquire nuclear weapons do not. And the reason we, the United States, do not want our allies to acquire nuclear weapons is that we want to have a single point of control on nuclear use and escalation. We're always worried about what was known as catalytic war during the Cold War, where an ally would start a war that we would have to finish, which is why we opposed the French. I mean, the French, I think we opposed everything. Right? Everyone hates the French. But we opposed the French program largely on those grounds. And what did we do with the British force? We talk about Britain as an independent nuclear state. And yeah, okay, nominally independent, but same trident pool, same technology. I consider Britain, with all due respect to anyone from the United Kingdom, basically an adjunct force of the United States. And we coordinate targeting. If Britain were really independent, you wouldn't just have a single submarine on deterrent patrol, right? You would have something more robust. It's only because Britain is basically a subjugated force, right? So, if Japan, one of the reasons why I think extended deterrence is so important in East Asia right now is that we don't want Japan and South Korea to pursue their own nuclear weapons. And there are real strategic reasons for that, so that in a crisis or conflict, there's a single point of decision making on nuclear use and escalation.
I agree with my colleagues.
All right, I'm just going to add on this particular point on extended deterrence in East Asia that certainly this is an important factor, and missile defenses have come up within the course of this discussion as something that the United States might be able to do to help protect its allies from some of the nuclear threats emanating from North Korea. But it does have knock-on effects for the US-China nuclear relationship, because China, and I would say also Russia, view the buildup of US missile defenses as a sort of nefarious way in which the United States can start to build missile defense architectures in East Asia that can also make China's nuclear arsenal less effective. And as I think Vipin mentioned, China has a pretty defensive nuclear strategy where it has a no first use policy. And if the arsenal becomes vulnerable, then it's going to have to build up its own capabilities and sees this as a sign of, I guess, US intent that the United States doesn't accept mutual vulnerability with China.
One thing is worth underscoring that Fiona mentioned is and you guys probably may have gotten this elsewhere so far, but counterforce is critically dependent on missile defenses, right? So missile defenses are not independent of a counterforce strategy, because in a world in which you don't have missile defenses, a counterforce strategy needs to have 100% reliability. You need to go after everything. When we say our missile defenses are for North Korea, for example, that may be true. But China fears that we can make their force look like North Korea's with our counterforce capabilities and then intercept the residuals that are left. And it's the coupling of missile defenses with an offensive counterforce strategy that really scares our adversaries, I think, because look, missile defenses don't work, but it is the fantasy that they might work one day here and the fear that they might work one day there that drives, I think, a lot of the competition more than the nuclear posture review. It's the missile defense piece that I think really scares Russia and China relative to our other capabilities.
That is a place where I would dissent. So we have on the order of 50 interceptors that are capable of being used against long-range missiles. Russia with 1,500 strategic systems, China with several hundred systems. And by the way, China's systems are mobile and they're well hidden. They're not sitting in easily identifiable positions. And the idea that we could, even through a first strike, attrit their forces to the extent that 50 or so interceptors could be used confidently against the Chinese force is, I think, just not realistic.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all, actually. I think the concern is this discrepancy between their perception of where we might get and the reality.
That's fine, and I think we should be careful about how we deploy ballistic missile defenses. But right now they're tuned for the North Korea contingency.
Right.
All right, now I think we'll turn over to audience questions, so leave your hands up and I'll begin with this gentleman here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, well, you said that you saw no
Speaker, just say who they are.
Sorry?
For the panelists.
Oh, sorry. I'm Ethan Bronner from Bloomberg. Apologies.
We met last night?
Yeah, we did. The other guys did. You said there's no way to negotiate an end to North Korea, and that the only possibility would be force. So I have two questions. One, should we have done it earlier? And two, should we just do it? Is that what you're suggesting?
It's not what I'm suggesting. I think that the consequences of war with North Korea would be devastating. And my own view is that we're very likely to have to face the deterrence option. There's a lot of talk about whether North Korea is, and interestingly, there was a debate between the current National Security Advisor and his immediate predecessor, well, not actually, his Democratic predecessor, where Ms. Rice had published something about saying deterrence is easy. We've done this with the Soviet Union. We can do it again. And General McMaster said it's not possible because, and he gave reasons that actually described a state that was very much like the Soviet Union, interestingly enough. My own view is that we're going to have to recreate the muscle memory that we once had about how to deter and apply it to North Korea. I see no reason, no prospect of them giving up their nuclear weapons for actually some of the reasons that Jim cited. I mean, they see this as critical to their own survival.
Gentleman in the black shirt.
I'm Spencer Ackerman with the Daily Beast. Given that point and taking your focus on 5 to 10 years outward of the North Korean nuclear program, you mentioned that as the stocks grow, you're going to just see the accumulation of fissile material in addition to the weapons and the delivery systems themselves. Given that all of this is occurring in this context of struggle with the United States and escalation, and the U.S.'s preferred answer to this is sanctions, don't the sanctions in that context risk incentivizing sales of fissile material? And if so, what should a U.S. response look like?
They do. As North Korea gets poorer, its ability to raise cash by selling something that's very small and very valuable is incentivized. But I also think that their willingness to do so is probably independent of sanctions. They've been willing to sell military equipment, almost any military equipment to almost anyone. They very likely sold uranium hexafluoride to the Libyan regime. They sold a plutonium production reactor to the Syrian regime. Just this past week, there was information about how they had assisted the Syrian chemical weapons program. So I think the going assumption has to be that they will try and sell fissile material or nuclear capabilities. They've demonstrated that already. And I think in terms of what we should do about it, is it has to be a multi-pronged response, including deterrence, including the capability to try and monitor them better. I would, for example, undertake diplomatic efforts to curtail overflight of countries with aircraft going to sensitive places. So for example, to fly between North Korea and Syria, you have to overfly other countries. Well, perhaps North Korea should be forced to have its aircraft inspected if that's going to happen.
Could I ask a quick counterforce? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I wanted to, when you're done, I want to offer two friendly or unfriendly amendments.
Sure.
Quick and incredibly ignorant counterforce question, because it's just something that I've heard talked about forever. And
You know, this
I
is the
don't
time to
understand
ask
that.
these questions, right? Because this is such a jargon-filled area. People are embarrassed to ask what end up being really important
All right,
questions.
turn off the camera. What tactically is the theory of how you accomplish counterforce without detonating a nuclear weapon?
You are detonating a nuclear weapon. I mean, part of the nuclear counterforce.
Why isn't that bad?
There's well,
So do you mean detonating your nuclear weapons
You're
or your
detonating theirs,
investors?
destroying
Their
theirs.
nuclear
again, I mean,
weapons.
you're detonating yours, so at that point, it really doesn't matter to you.
And so there's,
I mean, part of it is, I think that this distinction between counterforce and countervalue starts breaking down really quickly when you start thinking about how many targets you're destroying. I mean, it made, with Soviet systems in Siberia, okay, maybe I get the distinction, but we're talking about nuclear weapons close to urban centers in South Asia, in Korea, where like the distinction actually really falls. You were going to destroy this country one way or another. And what you tell yourself is, we're not intentionally targeting civilians, so you make yourself feel better. At the end of the day, the target set looks, and the destruction is going to look relatively similar. I just also want to get back to your question about preventive war. I think it's important to remember that or unpack the assumptions that people who support preventive war are making. I think there are three of them. One, that North Korea has offensive intentions. That it is not, that nuclear weapons for them are not just for regime survival or to prevent invasion. And that they have objectives besides that. Now they say they want unification of the peninsula. We say that. Okay, are they actually seriously interested in that by the use of force? Two, you have to believe that they're not deterrable. And that doesn't mean that Kim is crazy. It was interesting that Pompeo at one point used the argument that Kim is getting bad information, right? Which is different from being crazy, right? It's bound irrationality. It's Saddam invading Kuwait because he underestimated the chance that we were going to respond. And so I thought that was an interesting argument, because then you start seeing how their thinking is not necessarily that he's crazy, but he's going to get bad information, take a shot that he wouldn't otherwise take if he had full information. And he has those offensive aims. And the third thing you have to believe, which is probably true, I think this assumption is true, is that war now is better than war later because their stockpiles are growing. And I think those who think about preventive war now believe all three of those to be true. But if any one of those three is not true, then the preventive war logic falls apart. I think it's important to hold those who support it accountable for which assumptions are questionable.
I don't know that the first has to be true.
Well, there's that is that war is
He had
inevitable.
such bad information.
That war is so. I think the argument for going after all of their nuclear weapons and disarming the shield is war is inevitable, so war is better now than later. But war is only inevitable if you think they're going to start it, right? I think that's what that's the belief for those who support the preventive war laws.
Take another question, this gentleman over here, and especially if anybody has further questions on North Korea, definitely keep your hand up so we can keep this conversation going.
Yeah, my name is Varghese George. I write for the Hindu, Indian newspaper. My question, I think, is for Vipin. Thank you for the fascinating talk on India-Pakistan. The question is, do you see a difference between how the BJP government and the Congress government approach this issue?
I've seen no evidence that there is a distinction between the two. I think both Congress and the BJP. I mean, remember, Menon is a Congress National Security Advisor. I think if there's in terms of basic nuclear strategy, these options are being worked up. It's actually not totally irrational for India to start thinking about developing counterforce options given what they've faced and given actually a small target set. One thing we don't talk about is that arms control is a counterforcer's dream. If you can keep the arsenal small, you have a better chance of getting it, right? So in the Cold War, as Will said, you've got tens of thousands of Soviet systems, Russian systems you had to target. India only has to deal with 30 or 40. I could see somebody telling themselves a story. I don't think it's possible, but you could see somebody telling themselves a story. You know, we might be able to do this if we really had to. That's assuming that Pakistan doesn't, respond. But if there's a difference between the BJP and Congress, I think there's this notion that the BJP is less likely to be restrained in the face of provocation. And you see these surgical strikes, the visibility of having to respond. And I think if there's a distinction, it's that if there's another Bombay, you might not see the same response that the UPA had, but you might see a BJP government be more proactive, and then leading to cycles of escalation.
Yeah, so then that might be a fundamental difference which actually could set the region on an escalatory.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental issue is that Pakistan has revisionist incentives against India. We shouldn't forget that. But the Indian response right now, so far, the firebreak has been Indian restraint. I really believe that's true in a lot of ways. But if Indian restraint starts crumbling, then the enemy gets a vote. If India starts using conventional power across the international border in particular, then Pakistan has to respond.
If I could just, I'm Jennifer Griffin with Fox News. If I could go back to North Korea, is there anything that the current administration is doing in terms of North Korea's strategy that you can see how this ends? Because we can all talk ourselves into
Badly.
what's wrong with each move that we see being made and how it all seems to be heading towards a military conflict or can go terribly wrong. Is there anything that you see that is strategically wise that they're doing and that you see how this is going to play out? And also, in terms of counterforce strategy, can you use a conventional attack for counterforce strategy that could be effective to take out someone's nuclear arsenal or program?
Will, you want to start?
Sure. So taking your last question first, the biggest problem with North Korean nuclear weapons is finding them. Once you've found them, conventional forces are more than adequate to attack them. It doesn't necessarily take a nuclear. It may be somewhat more reliable, but we have if we can find their forces, we have the conventional capabilities to take them out. But it's very difficult to find them. It's an opaque regime. They've got lots of underground facilities. They're mobile now. Their nuclear forces are becoming more mobile. And so finding these things, I think, would be a very difficult thing to do. In terms of what are they doing that might be right, we don't, if you look at the rhetoric that's coming from the Trump administration, they're building the case that it is impossible to deter North Korea. but we don't know why they're doing that. And it's very clear that as long as China is willing to support North Korea, sanctions, negotiations, all these other things will not be effective. We can say, well, we've implemented comprehensive sanctions. And admittedly, the last year or so have been fundamentally different and have been tougher. But during the period from about 2000 to 2015, the amount of total aid, trade, and investment going into North Korea went from about $3 billion a year to about $9 billion a year. For an economy that's about $25 billion, this is a huge amount of inflow. And by the way, 90% of that came from China. So if you're sitting in Pyongyang and saying, well, I'm facing tougher sanctions, except I'm getting 3 times as much money from abroad than I once did, those sanctions don't really seem to be fighting very hard. China's fundamental interest is avoidance of instability, war being the worst case of instability. So to the extent that China can be convinced that the United States is actually willing to go to war unless it takes decisive action, that could be used for leverage to get Beijing more involved.
I'd like to jump in on the North Korea thing because I never did get to respond to what you said before. So I've studied North Korea for about 15 years. I've been to North Korea. I've talked to North Korean officials in North Korea about nuclear weapons and participated in various Trek 2s and authored a study with my colleague John Park at Harvard on sanctions, where we interviewed North Korean defectors whose job was to illicitly procure equipment and material for their program. It is understandable and fashionable, I'll say, to say that there's no way North Korea is ever going to give up its nuclear weapons. Now, I get why people say that, but 15 years of talking to North Koreans has taught me never to say never about North Korea. The argument for preventive war is often, we have to do this now or it'll be all over, it'll be terrible. And you know, that's not the way life works, actually. More often than not, other things happen that we can't even anticipate now, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. Whether it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, the liberalization of China, whatever it is. But what happens is the preventive war folks want to make this a binary thing. Yes or no, now or not. And that's not the way life works. The great thing about a one-person dictatorship is that if the one person changes his mind, it's done. He doesn't have to worry about the press. He doesn't have to worry about his legislature. He doesn't have to worry about his constitution. And so that he, by the way, or she, might be a different person in a year or 5 years or 6 years. There are all sorts of things that can happen. So I don't say never when it comes to North Korea.
My never was this regime.
Well,
And if there's peaceful reunification,
but anyway,
that works.
Anyway, to complete my thought, the other thing was on coercion, and I think you're right to say that, they've sold chem weapons to Syria, and they sold a reactor, although I've never seen evidence of a reprocessing plant. You can't build a nuclear weapon without a reprocessing plant, a plutonium reactor, to Syria. I think the North Koreans make a distinction, and I would make a distinction between selling missiles and chem and throwing around fissile material. And I do think, even if they are open to that anyway, to speak to your question, the more you squeeze them and the more effective you are in squeezing them, then the more reason they have to consider that. So even if they might be open to it to begin with, there's no depth, there's still a curve here, right? And the more you squeeze, the higher the incentive. I think I had something else, but I forgot.
Can I also just say something very quickly on so there was a time during which it looked like the coercive diplomacy strategy was actually what the administration was trying to implement, but they were going long on coercion and short on diplomacy. And over time, it seems like they're just less interested in the diplomacy side. But there's a world in which Will is right, where the target may not be North Korea but China. And China, I think in the administration there's a belief that China can at least help us more. And so how do you change the Chinese calculation, which is currently they fear North Korean collapse more than they fear North Korean nuclear weapons? Can you make the threat of real instability on the peninsula, which I think would shift the calculation a little bit, so that China can do more? China can't solve the problem. China doesn't want to solve the problem. In fact, who benefits geopolitically the most from this festering wound in our policy? It's China, probably. And so how do you change the Chinese incentive? And the problem when you have two targets is that North Korea can start misperceiving how long you're going on coercion for a potential preventive attack when you're running B-1s up there, you know what. So it's a very risky strategy, and I would prefer, I think, for the strategy to be, it has to be more coherent, one. Two, if your coercive diplomacy has to have both pieces in equilibrium, right? And if you're going long on coercion, short on diplomacy, to the point where you're basically cutting the legs off of diplomacy, then it's very difficult to implement that strategy. On the counterforce question, Will is absolutely right. I would say in the Indian case, I mean, for the US, I think we can do conventional if we can find everything. Other countries, their concern is that their intelligence and surveillance will have a lag time. And so to deal with the uncertainties and the movement of capabilities, they need the nuclear blast. And so, you know, nuclear counterforce tends to, in a lot of cases, it's going to be nuclear. And even in the North Korean case, I would think it was General Barno and Nora Bensahal had this article in War on the Rocks where they made the point that if it's going to be a surprise attack, and you need to use, you know, long-range systems, we don't, at this point, it might have to be nuclear if you're not going to, if you can't stage.
I'm just going to offer two really brief comments on this discussion, particularly on China's views on the North Korean issue. And I think what you have seen in the past year is some more discussion. Again, in China, you have an ebb and flow within the Chinese strategic community discussing whether or not North Korea policy should change. That happened around, I think, 2008, 2009. It's now happening again, that there's discussion in China about really what is in our strategic interests when it comes to dealing with the North Korea issue. Is supporting North Korea more of a burden to us strategically than it is a benefit? But ultimately, I think there are two sticking points in China putting more pressure on North Korea. The first is that it perceives the threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons very differently to the United States. China does not see North Korea's nuclear weapons as fundamentally being a destabilizing presence on the peninsula. They mirror image a lot of what China did in the 1960s to defend itself from what it saw as US nuclear threats during the Korean War. And essentially, North Korea's nuclear weapons are about ensuring its survival against US threats. So that's the first difference. And the second is when it comes to instability on the peninsula, the real end game for China is what a successor regime to the Kim regime, regardless of how it comes about, means for the US-China relationship going forward, and whether it means that you will have a unified Korea on China's border, which is pro-United States. And I think that is a bigger problem and concern for China than North Korean nuclear weapons, and in some ways instability. I have also heard discussions coming out of Beijing now that they are much more concerned about the risk of nuclear accident coming from North Korean nuclear facilities within, across the border into northern China, as well as earthquakes and environmental issues that are coming from North Korean testing. So there are some serious costs to China from the way that North Korea is behaving. And I think there is a diminishing sense within China that this is a blood brother, iron bond relationship. It's more about, China thinking what is in its interests. And I would say the future of geopolitics in Northeast Asia is the most important consideration. Okay, I'm going to go to this gentleman here.
May I make a proposal, Madam
Yes,
Chair?
please.
I think we have more questioners than we have time to get to all the questions.
We might
So-
collect a couple.
And I was going to say, let's,
Jim, it doesn't end at 10:30.
Oh, it doesn't.
We're going until 11,
Okay.
so we still have a little bit more time.
I
But this gentleman.
retract my proposal.
If that's okay. Yes, thank you.
I'm Jiha Ham with Voice of America. I want to go back to the very beginning. So what's the reason North Korea is pursuing this nuclear weapon? I mean, North Koreans say that they are doing this because of the U.S.'s threat, the United States' hostile policy. But is there one? I mean, I am personally from South Korea, and I lived most of my young life there. And the North Korean side was the hostile one, not the U.S. or South Korea or any of their allies. I served South Korean military too for 2 years, and our main role is to defend. Nothing related to hostile. So of course there is a joint military exercise between with the U.S. and South Korea. But like, can that be a kind of reasonable reason for their like pursuing nuclear weapons? That
Well, so North Korea's nuclear program really starts in the mid-'80s, prior to any recent administration, right? I think there are, like most nuclear weapons programs, there are multiple goals, multiple reasons why people pursue them. But, I think, and of course, when you go to North Korea, they take you to some museum that shows you that actually it was the U.S. and South Korea that was the aggressor during the Korean War. So, I don't know if people believe that story, but that's the story they're telling to their domestic population. But in any case, because as Will rightly says, they are so opaque, and because we've had leadership changes over time, right? I don't think, there's the North Korean playbook, but I think you can make a pretty good case that Kim Jong-un is different than his father. And Kim Jong-il was different than Kim Il-sung. So there's both continuity, but individuals matter. In a monarchy, individuals matter, and that's what we have here is a race-based monarchy. So with them being opaque, it's hard to know, so there are some possibilities. I think that they probably do feel threatened, and there's still some historical lag from the Korean War, regardless of who started it first. I fear, though, a la Vipin, that they might, that for them, using them as an umbrella for more conventional provocations, that's a possibility. I mean, I think the regime is a rational actor, and my evidence for that is, as their geostrategic position has changed, the provocations have changed. So when we had the Cold War and we had the superpower competition, nuclear competition, that sort of meant that the U.S. and the Soviets would step in before anything got too hot. And that sort of gave them space to be really provocative. I mean, the stuff they do now is nothing compared to what they used to do, right? Sending commando to the Blue House, sub with commandos to kill the leadership, blowing up a civilian airline, blowing up the dais in Burma, killing South. Now, those are provocations, right? Cutting a hotline, not so much. Conducting tests on your own soil, not so much. Why did they change? Soviet Union went away. And so they've been pretty good at sort of trying to figure out where the line is, the line being you cross this line and it leads to war, and staying just below that line. So they're rational in the main, but that doesn't mean they're perfect and can't make mistakes and can't miscalculate or can't get themselves in the situations they're not prepared for.
I mean, I think the level of provocation has fallen a lot since they've gone, nuclear weapons are supposed to make, in the theory of the nuclear revolution, make them secure. The provocations that the ROK-US alliance has faced prior to nuclearization is worse than I think anything we faced since they've acquired nuclear weapons. And, when people equate North Korea to Pakistan, it's really different. The Kargil peaks are ripe for fait accomplis. You take this peak, you take this peak, done. What are you going to do across the DMZ? Like, where is North Korea going to go? This notion that they're going to aggress. Maybe they take a shot at a U.S. aircraft. Okay, we've seen that before, though. Sinking the Chonan. We've seen that before. And we've been able to deal with that before. Is it worth risking a nuclear war now over that? Probably not. And is there a theory where North Korea can aggress militarily against literally the most powerful conventional alliance on the planet? I don't see a theory. I don't see how that works. And so it's hard for me to see the analogy to Pakistan that I hear some people making.
So I agree with all that's been said. I would just add a couple points, though, in terms of the North Korean nuclear program does date from at least the mid-'80s. But we saw a pretty serious acceleration afterwards. And I would ascribe the acceleration to two things. First, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which removed a key ally. And North Korea had always wanted to maintain a balance between China and Russia, didn't want to become too dependent on one or the other. And once one of them went away, and with it all of the economic and military support, they became much more dependent on China, and I think they were looking for a source of power that was indigenous. And then second, the demonstrated ability of the United States to use conventional forces, particularly air power, to basically take apart a government. And it was used in now several cases, starting with the first Iraq War, but later in the Balkans, and then finally in Libya.
If you have a question, can you just leave your hand up so I get you on the list? Or Friedman with The Atlantic. I'm curious, well, you mentioned this a little bit, but that there'll be certain vectors of changes that come out 5 years from now if we're in a new deterrence relationship with North Korea. I'm curious from you and all of you, if you could discuss what you think a world like that looks like 5 years from now. How would U.S. security thinking change? How would the security situation on the peninsula change? Assuming maybe there are some limits on how far they develop, but that they have the ability to threaten the United States, and we're in a new deterrence relationship.
So I do believe the world will become more dangerous, but weighing the alternative of immediate war, I think that danger is even greater. So I would say we need to prepare for the ways in which the growing abundance of fissile material in North Korea will lead to these dangers along the 5 vectors. I think the appropriate response is containment and deterrence, and that means actions sort of across the board, from deployment of some military capabilities to rallying allies to diplomacy, both with North Korea and also with China and also our allies. We've done this before. We did this vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. North Korea is a far smaller threat than the Soviet Union. It doesn't represent an ideology that's persuasive to any other state. It has a minuscule economy. Walgreens has more revenues than North Korea has GDP. If North Korea were a South Korean company, it would be the 10th largest company in South Korea. So this is a puny little nation, and we can do this. But it will require us to act across the board to meet the threats.
I would add, I agree with everything that Will said, but we can't continue this, and he's right, but sometimes what people conclude from that is, we don't have to talk to them, we don't have to deal with them, they need to settle on our terms. And I'm old school. I believe you hold your friends closer and your enemies closer. And there are 2 ways this goes down. Well, there are 3 ways. They start an attack. I don't think they're going to do it because they're not suicidal. The thing that Kim wants is to hold on to power. He's not going to wake up one morning and say, I want to commit suicide. The other way, the second way is that, which I would have doubted until this bloody nose, the Victor Cha, and now the resignation of Joe Yoon, all pointing in a direction that we're not going to engage in diplomacy. I think that's very unsettling. So we might start something, but it seems to me the most probable way is that someone screws up. There's misperception, miscalculation. It is the most opaque country in the world. I don't think we understand them very well, and I talk to our intel people all the time. So what is the medicine for miscalculation? You need to have communication with your adversary. We had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. How many people did Stalin kill? We had diplomatic relations with China after a while. We need to keep talking. One of the things, yes, will it be hard to get an agreement that would freeze or constrain? Yes. But whether you get that or not, and I'm probably more optimistic than some on that, the important thing is having communication channels that are open. So we have to talk to them on a regular basis. Whether we're just talking, or whether it's about an agreement or whatever, if we're going to inoculate ourselves against the most likely path to war, which is mistake, then we need to improve our security, enhance our security by making sure there's open and continuous and constant communication.
Just 2 very quick footnotes. One, the equation of brutality with irrationality is troubling, because the 2 have nothing to do with each other. In fact, you could argue that the more brutal regimes are actually more rational because they're trying to deter, or deal with domestic threats. So they're responding to domestic incentives in ways they think are rational. But the 2 really have nothing to do with it. Just because a regime is internally brutal does not mean it'll be externally irrational. The second thing is related to what both Will and Jim said. Deterrence relationships are very difficult to establish early on because both sides are trying to figure out where each other's lines are. And if you don't have communication, then that's when the risk of miscalculation is very high, right? So that's the political problem early on in a deterrence relationship. At a strategic level, especially with an emerging nuclear power, early on is also when they have the itchiest trigger finger because they're so scared of survivability. North Korea cannot be confident given all we talk about counterforce and how small a peninsula it is, if I were Kim, it would be very rational to be worried about the survivability of my forces, which means if I think the balloon is going up, my incentive is to go first, go massively with everything. Over time, things get better. I have more forces, I'm more relaxed, I kind of have better indicators about what a preventive attack might look like. And so at all levels, this phase is the most dangerous. And cutting off communication seems like to be one of the more counterproductive things we can do. I mean, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think, not a conspiracy theorist, but Joseph Yun retiring now, it's like, take one for the team, man. You're the only guy. So how bad is it that he's deciding to retire now? And that scares me.
I'm just going to draw out one contrast before we go to the next question really quickly, which is noting what Vipin's just said about basically early on in the deterrence relationship when you're really worried about survivability is a point of a lot of instability and a lot of nuclear risks. Yet, as Will also noted in his presentation, as the arsenal grows, there's a whole bunch of other really serious
You're
risks.
trading risks every year.
So they're just a different kind of things. More is both better as well as worse, but for different kinds of escalation risks in the relationship.
That's exactly right. They are. You worry about user or loser pressures early. You worry about command and control and security as the arsenals grow. And Pakistan is facing proliferation, external proliferation.
Okay.
I mean, AQ Khan did it even before they got.
I'm going to ask this lady here.
Hi, my name is Erica Pandy. I'm with Axios, and my question's for Vipin. I'm wondering what the best case scenario is for a situation like India, Pakistan, or Israel, and if a country in the Middle East acquires weapons, where there's one actor that's sponsoring terrorists and the other state can't retaliate. Like, the public must be outraged after 2008. And then also follow up to that, after you answer that one, what's India's relationship like with China in terms of the nuclear?
Oh yeah, right. So two very good questions. On the first one, this is why the again political dialogue and the Indians and Pakistanis had the comprehensive, now composite, I forget what they call it now. Every government calls it something else, but it's comprehensive dialogue, composite dialogue. The idea is, how do you get Pakistan to stop sponsoring terrorism against metropolitan India, right? Because prevention is the best solution, because you don't want to get yourself in a situation where you have this domestic political pressure for retaliation, because then it leads to all these escalation pressures. And so India has invested a lot, I think Israel has, in preventive measures, right? Intelligence and how many attacks have been disrupted. We don't know publicly, but there have been several that the Indian government will point to and say, they disrupted, attacks from Pakistan, terrorist attacks on Indian soil sponsored by Pakistan. And that has to kind of be the way forward until Pakistan or the adversary abandons the revisionism. Now, there's also this theory that the revisionism is short-lived. So you get nuclear weapons, you have these objectives, you try to use these nuclear weapons to get what you promised your domestic public, your audience, that you would try to get once you got nuclear weapons, and you either get it and you're done. Hopefully you don't try to expand your appetite, but that may happen, or it's thwarted. And I think in the Pakistani case, we're reaching the point where the Pakistani system has to say, like, how long are we going to continue this? The problem is that the military is invested in the nuclear program and the conflict with India. How do you justify 50% of the budget if you don't have an existential threat across the border? And so there are real incentives for the Pakistan army to keep the threat of India alive. And how do you do that? Well, the threat of a periodic crisis doesn't hurt, or heating things up along the line of control. At some point, reorienting the civil-military balance is a big piece of this puzzle. Sorry, the second question was? China, India, yeah. So, China and India, at least up until now, have looked like your best case scenario for mutually assured destruction. Both have pledged no first use. There's really no ladder for escalation to a point where either faces an existential threat. The problem will be, when you face multiple nuclear adversaries, and this is a problem the U.S. has with its nuclear posture. We talk about tailored deterrence. You can't tailor deterrence to everybody if you're tailoring it to Russia, right? Because what you do to deal with the Russian threat is going to look very aggressive to North Korea and to China. So India is going to start facing this problem where if you want to start having counterforce towards Pakistan, how do you convince China you're not coming after their forces? The same kinds of architectures.
Follow up to that, as China gets more buddy-buddy with Pakistan through the Belt and Road Initiative and even turns southwest and starting getting involved in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, does India get more nervous.
Yeah, I mean, I think so India's decoupled them at a nuclear level, but on a political level, they've always linked the two, right? But not in a conflict. I don't think India's ever really worried about, India says two-front war. That'll never happen. China has never, and probably will never, fight on behalf of Pakistan. It will arm them to the teeth, but there's no evidence the Chinese will ever fight on their behalf. And I don't think India ever has to worry, in a nuclear planning sense, about dealing with both at the same time. And I think what India is trying to do from a nuclear strategy perspective is separate the two. We want to have whatever we have to Pakistan, but we want to maintain a no first use counter-value strategy towards China. And I think they can convince China that because China thinks India's program's a joke. And so it doesn't really worry about India. Because if you're China sizing your force to the US threat, like what's India? Like it's like literally a thorn in your side. So I don't think China is really too worried about it. And I think that kind of helps the dynamic. I do worry about the Doklam in a non-nuclear sense. The border dispute between India and China last year, which was in Bhutan, was the most serious confrontation that they've had since the '62 war. And I don't think it's over. And I think that this issue about demarcating and delimiting the line of actual control could be a flashpoint for like local conflict, but I don't see a way that it escalates anyway to like the nuclear level.
The last thing I would just add on this particular point, though, is I think India's pursuit of counterforce or thinking about counterforce would have implications for China's, I guess, the nuclear balance with China. Similarly, anything that China does in order to ensure its arsenal is survivable against the United
Makes it
States,
harder.
especially as the US, if it continues to invest in missile defense in East Asia, is going to put pressures on India's nuclear arsenal too. So there is that third-party element. Okay, this gentleman over here. And any other questions? If I haven't given you a nod, just keep your hand up.
Idris from Reuters. Pakistan's nuclear weapon, I guess, has the interesting situation where U.S. officials are concerned not only about the physical safety, but also more so the sort of people who work in the plant or facilities and their sort of mindset. So as a U.S. policymaker, on the one hand, you're putting pressure, over the past few months, but at the same time, you are giving money to make sure that the nuclear weapons are safe. So how do you sort of juggle those two? I mean, because at some point you can't put more pressure because you're concerned the nuclear weapons are going to become unsafe, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a theory that Pakistan's too nuclear to fail. It's a very tough situation, but I think, and Pakistan has manipulated that to their benefit, right? Which is, don't put too much pressure on us. If we crack, we have 100 nuclear weapons, and you don't know where they're going to end up. I don't know that there's an easy way to square that. I mean, part of that is, the pressure so far on Pakistan has been largely rhetorical. There have been buffers along the way, being the gray area now, but only in June, which gives there's time. There's time for like a full cutoff to be avoided, and I think that's kind of what the U.S. administration the Trump administration was trying to do. And maybe it's not a bad strategy. I mean, but at the same time, if there ever were a nuclear terrorist event and it was linked back to Pakistan, what the consequences would be. I mean, that would be, it would be, second-order deterrence. You hold the state responsible. So unless the system fully cracks, and then you have to worry. I'm sure we've worked up, as unpalatable as it may be, render-safe options in Pakistan too. But as the arsenal grows, that becomes harder also. I don't think there's a good answer to that. But I think the Pakistan government and the SPD understand the risks. And they've instituted personnel reliability and human reliability programs and layered security. Will and Matt know much more about this than I do, but my sense is there is sufficient confidence in those programs today that it's a professional force, and they understand the consequences of and the importance of nuclear security. But there really isn't a good answer. If you do put enough pressure on them, they've used that to their advantage in the past.
Hi. Actually, at this point, I think I have 3 questions, so I'm going to let you guys decide. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about hybrid warfare and how that affects nuclear calculus. If we could talk, Fiona, if you wanted to talk about China's nuclear posture and if that is changing at all. Like you, I also, for many years, thought that they were satisfied and had enough, but with the change in the strategic rocket forces and the elevation of that to a whole new branch of the PLA, and some of the submarine activities. I'm wondering if you have different feelings about that or not, or if your thinking is changing. And third, on North Korea, we talk about diplomacy, but no one has really said anything yet about the underlying, like it seems like there's general consensus on the panel that North Korea has a desire for regime security, and that is what nuclear weapons are used for. At this point, what can you, even in a crazy imaginary game, suggest would give them regime security without nuclear weapons? And no one else has mentioned freeze for freeze yet. Is arms control not part of the diplomacy that we keep talking about?
Why don't you go first?
Sure. I will take the China question first, which is, my understanding is that the creation of the Strategic Rocket Force was a change in name. It is not a change in mission or an increase in the prominence of nuclear weapons in China's thinking about its national security. I haven't seen any signs that the goals of China's nuclear forces have changed from the two goals that it has always had, which is countering other countries from being able to make nuclear threats to change Chinese behavior, and having the ability to retaliate if another country decides to use its nuclear weapons against China. They'll obviously be reviewing doctrine, as I would assume with the creation of the new force. That will happen, I think, across the entire People's Liberation Army as they write new procedures and they write new training manuals, etc. But I don't expect, and I haven't seen any signs to suggest that China is moving towards different goals for its nuclear arsenal. It is going to, I think its force will always be, I guess, dynamic or responsive to the kinds of threats to the arsenal that might come from, for example, the United States. So whatever it is that the United States does that may be posing threats to China's nuclear capabilities, you can expect, for example, the Chinese arsenal to grow to make sure that it can continue to survive a US first strike and to retaliate even if the United States has greater missile defenses. And so I think if you look at where China has been making tests in things like missile defense and in glide vehicles, these may have nuclear applications to make sure that they have a secure retaliatory force in the future rather than necessarily being used for a more aggressive nuclear strike. I haven't seen any signs that China is moving towards deploying tactical nuclear weapons, which would suggest to me changes in something more of a warfighting strategy. So that's the China piece, but I'll defer to others on the other aspects. And obviously, disagreements on China are also welcome.
Does that mean you think that they're going to keep their warheads separate on subs? How do you do that?
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think that they will necessarily
So that means
keep
they
them.
will have nuclear-tipped submarine ballistic launch missiles.
Right, they will, but at the same time, if they were sending out their road mobile ballistic missiles on a patrol, they would also be mated at that particular point in time. So the question will really be about what deployment mode China chooses for its nuclear submarines, as to whether it's a continuous patrol at sea where they are confident that they have command and control. But essentially China's been very tight-lipped about what kind of deployment mode it might be looking at for its submarines, and furthermore, the current generation of ballistic missile submarines in China's nuclear arsenal are very noisy, and my understanding is they'd be picked up by anti-submarine warfare capabilities of other countries pretty quickly operating off China's coast, so they're not really a survivable capability.
Yeah, I mean, you could keep them separate, it'd be a bad idea. I mean, no one has done it.
Yeah,
And
so to me that assumes a change.
The Indians confronted this, and there was this whole notion of the Indian force as like the Chinese separate warheads, not only demated, but component separation. But then you see them canisterizing their land-based systems and an SSBN. I mean, it's not your grandfather's nuclear force in India anymore, and I think people don't appreciate that also. They just made a decision that we can keep centralized control and have fully mated ready systems that are sealed and where the warhead is pre-mated on land and at sea. And I think the sea-based leg drove India to do it, and I suspect the same is going to happen in China.
On North Korea and what deterrence do they have in the absence of nuclear weapons and arms control? Well, they had deterrence before 2006. They have whatever number of thousands of artillery tubes pointed at Seoul. It is asymmetric, right? They can hit Seoul, which is the main city of the 13th biggest economy in the world, easier than we can go, in theory, easier than we can go after them. And in the early years, people thought, well, maybe their nuclear program, this is the old Eisenhower new look, that they're investing in nuclear because they can't afford to maintain a conventional force. But it looks like they are investing in their conventional force, at least in rockets, that would be used, again, as part of the conventional deterrent. So I think part of it is convincing them that we're not going to attack because we're not going to put Seoul at risk. It may be that their desire to hit the U.S. homeland is less about deterring an attack up the peninsula and more about trying to decouple South Korea and the U.S. Right, so that would be a different sort of thing. They might think that they have conventional deterrence, but holding the U.S. homeland hostage gets them something different. And then you would have to approach that as a different problem to solve. On arms control, it's worth remembering that the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the originators of arms control in the nuclear age, that was not about disarmament. No one was talking about disarmament with SALT I and the hotline and SALT II. That was all about producing strategic stability. And what have we been talking about today? Producing strategic stability. So I think there is room for that. Yes, I believe in a denuclearized peninsula, and I think we should have a denuclearized peninsula. But if everyone agreed to that, including the North Koreans today, it would still take 10 years, where we would have confidence with verification that there wasn't something in a mountain or blah, 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 blah. So it's going to take time. So it makes sense to make your first step first, which is freeze, then constrain, and hopefully roll back. And you buy yourself time for history to work itself out in the meantime. So I think there's very much a role for arms control. And if you insist on zero right at the beginning of the conversation, you may not get the conversation. But there's much to be achieved in the first and the second and the fourth steps.
I keep hoping there's wiggle room when we say the goal is CVID. You can say that when everybody knows it's not, but I mean, I don't know that there's enough wiggle room in our
CVID is
comprehensive, verifiable, what's the I?
Irreversible.
Denuclearization.
Complete disarmament, yeah.
Complete verifiable, irreversible denuclearization.
We're trying not to slip into jargon.
So I'll take on your hybrid warfare, at least to question to some extent. I think hybrid warfare makes general warfare more likely, and with general warfare being more likely, the possibility of nuclear warfare is more likely. So those linkages are not ironclad, but the risk is greater. On your question about arms control and North Korea, I think you all probably know already where I stand. I would note the freeze for freeze proposal that you mentioned. So that it would be, North Korea would freeze its long-range ballistic missile and nuclear weapons tests in exchange for a freeze on military exercises by the United States and the Republic of Korea. I don't think that addresses the central U.S. security concern, because even if you implemented that, the North Korean arsenal and stock of fissile material would continue to grow.
All right, so we now have about 10 minutes left. We still have 4 questions, so I'm going to take 2 and 2 and ask our panelists to answer quickly in questions brief 2. So starting with Ed and Bouchard. Go ahead.
Hi, Edward Wong from the New York Times. One thing that I've read in popular writing on Kim Jong-un and North Korea is that they look at what happened with Gaddafi in Libya, and that's a factor, that could be a factor in them never wanting to give up their weapons program. I'm just wondering whether you've seen any intelligence or information that shows that this is in fact the case, whether this is a factor for the North Korean regime, or whether it's purely speculative. And then second, whether when the Obama administration took on its policy in Libya, whether it should have this should have factored into its thinking about the knock-on effects that it might have on other regimes.
The answer to...
We'll just grab the
Oh, I'm
second
sorry, I
question as well.
apologize.
Yeah.
Yep.
Usha Sahai from More on the Rocks. I wanted to ask you guys about rhetoric, which is something that most of us in this room have had to cover over the last year, for better or for worse. And so in terms of how we think about sort of underlying strategic dynamics, how can we think about when rhetoric matters and can change those dynamics, and when is it sometimes something that doesn't really change anything and is maybe being overblown, particularly given sort of the churn of the media environment? How can we think about that in a more useful way?
I'll take the first swing on these two. Speculation, this Libya